I want to talk about Barcelona's cubes, because they represent one of the most fascinating human-centered attempts at urban planning in history. In the 1800s, Barcelona was not a pleasant place to live. In order to reduce the pressure of a rising population density, which increased the likelihood for disease and general displeasure, the old walls of Barcelona that caged its population were torn down, and the council had to organize a competition for planners to decide how the city should expand. One of those planners was a man named Ildefons Cerdà. He was an engineer that had his toes dipped in politics. He had a deep respect for the working class, wrote the book on the general theory of urbanization before urbanization was remotely cool and even a thing, and he was an active member of the national militia and city council of Barcelona. In order to craft his magnum opus of city planning, he ended up writing one of the most exhaustive studies on working class living conditions ever. He did extensive surveys of rich and poor people. He identified a relationship between class and space, with the bourgeois having an average of 3.6 cubic meters of space per person, while the working class had 0.9. He analyzed interiors of homes and studied ventilation to try and determine optimal street widths for airflow. But his largest goal, unconventional at the time and increasingly vogue now, was to have an empirically backed, rigorous view on how to create a city centered around public health. And independent of your taste in design or view on urban planning, it's a marvel of human ingenuity. One of the first things you'll notice is the straight grid pattern, which is different from traditional radial city designs. This was a practical choice. Grids are easier to navigate than circles, and they're also probably easier to build on. But it also tells you something about Cerdà's focus on equality. Instead of making the new blocks an extension of one main hub, the old city, which would establish a hierarchical relationship, all roads point to the old, Cerdà instead focused on uniting the older city with 7 peripheral villages, which weren't much at the time but are now. The new city wasn't really an extension, in so much that it was just the city. This is something a radial city design can't really do justice to, like, for example, in a city like Paris. Now, that being said, it would be wrong to say he invented grids. No, that would just be wrong. But Cerdà's grid was unique. Compared with other cities, his proposal was unique for laying out large city blocks and spacious, well-organized intersections. He deliberated over multiple different types of street, but decided on one mainly uniform width. According to him, it wasn't a planner's task to create artificial preferences, privileges, and monopolies to the detriment of others. But what makes the topic of street design even more fascinating and captivating than it already is that he predicted the rise of the motor car, and so he designed the minimum street width as well as the chamfered edges so that it could meet the advances of the next century, not only because it looked cool. And yes, facilitating lots of cars is not necessarily always seen as a good thing, especially by YouTubers who like to project their views on urban design to the rest of the world. But it was still impressive that he predicted a highly mobile form of transport, and he built a plan to match the challenges of the next century. He had also designed provisions for underground trains and elaborate sanitation plans, but the most remarkable part of his plan were his city blocks. The goal was to define the boundaries of buildings on each plot of land and also design a space that could provide sufficient air renewal, sufficient sunlight, introduce aspects of rural into urban life, and allow for easy, relaxed movement for pedestrians. It was not only the edges of the blocks that would allow for movement, but it would also be within them. Blocks would also have the benefit of being modular and easily attachable. And each block, generally, would have no more than 3 buildings in total, with an expectation that many of the city blocks would have 2 open sides. The plan presented mainly 3 types of block: middle courtyard, the U, and the L, which are incredibly advanced names I came up with myself. In the middle of each city block would be plenty of room for green space designed for, you, a human. It would provide high-quality air, make people feel better, and it was based off of Cerdà's ground values to make as much of urban life as rural as possible. So the green space was also intended to help produce connections for the people living inside the buildings. He also recommended height requirements in order for there to be adequate sunlight. But of course he had to go a step further. See, when you place these individual blocks next to each other, you can begin to construct different types of permutations. The grid block combination allows you to order much larger, complex shapes in order to create special areas for public institutions like administrative and industrial buildings, cemeteries, parks, and hospitals. The blocks could also be placed in a manner so that the individual parts would create a better whole, which would encourage ventilation and mobility across the entire city. Now, all of this said, if you've been to Barcelona or live there, you might be a bit confused. You're probably thinking, Cerdà's vision with plenty of green space is not how Barcelona looks, but someone random on the internet, who I always unconditionally trust no matter what, is telling me something different. But your doubts are actually justified. Accessible courtyards with plenty of green space and open sides were the rule in Cerdà's vision, but today they are the exception. Instead, Barcelona has the luxury of having a bunch of four-sided blocks and a lot of drunk tourists. And that's because Cerdà's plan was modified multiple times. Due to external pressures, most buildings were first extended, parking garages were constructed, the sides would be filled up, and the height requirements would be ignored. The result is multiple four-sided courtyards across the entire city filled with parking garages rather than green space. As opposed to having multiple open courtyards that could allow people to walk across the entire city, the sidewalks on the side of the blocks are practically the only option. The plan was also intended to be anything but hierarchical, but today it actually is. For many, the negative repercussions of these modifications may seem obvious, but there is a silver lining. For one, the cubes of Barcelona today got me to make this video. In exchange for high-quality air, pedestrian mobility, and a stronger sense of community, you instead get a superficial YouTube video, essentially inspired by one Wikipedia article, with a reliance on much smarter academics for my own gain. But it would also be incorrect to say that Cerdà's vision failed. Cities evolve, and Barcelona is still changing, and it's safe to say that he laid a groundwork for where it's headed. As Barcelona attempts to greenify its city, which isn't a word but still sounds right, Cerdà's original intentions come in handy. Not only are the courtyards being reclaimed, albeit slowly, bringing back some communal green space, but the blocks make policies such as superblocks a lot easier, which means segmenting off large areas of city where there will be requirements for maybe slower cars, no cars at all, and investment in green infrastructure. If the citizens of Barcelona were not able to thank Cerdà in the 1900s and early 21st century for the values he tried to craft a city around, perhaps they'll be able to thank him in the coming future. Before any of you attention-deficient apes click off this video, I want to give a special thank you to Professor Neuman.
I do agree with you. Planning's, it's not rocket science. That's correct. It's much more complex.
This guy is qualified and he knows his stuff about Cerdà, and so I would really highly recommend you read his papers. Well, just generally a lot of papers on this. You should be an informed person. Anyways, you get the point. Thank you, Professor Neuman, again for helping me with this video, and thanks for watching. I just repeated that because that's what everybody else says.